The evening lecture hall at Northwestern University hummed with nervous energy as Professor Amelia Rhodes wrote an equation across the blackboard that seemed to stretch into infinity. Students shifted uncomfortably as she stepped back, brushing chalk dust from her hands with a satisfied smirk. "Anyone who can solve this equation," she announced with a mocking laugh, "I'll marry them on the spot." A few students chuckled nervously. Near the door, a janitor named Ethan Ward paused his mopping, his eyes drawn to the board. He whispered, "Riemann tensor, compact form." Professor Rhodes turned sharply. "What did you say?" Ethan's hands trembled on the mop handle. "I think I can solve it." Professor Amelia Rhodes had been groomed for greatness since birth. Her father, Dr. Marcus Rhodes, was a renowned theoretical physicist at MIT, whose name appeared in quantum mechanics textbooks worldwide. Her mother, Dr. Sarah Chen Rhodes, had solved 3 of the 7 Millennium Prize problems before retiring to raise Amelia in their Cambridge mansion. But raising Amelia meant something different in their household. Where other children had bedtime stories, Amelia had mathematical proofs. Where others played with dolls, she manipulated geometric shapes and solved logic puzzles. The dining room table hosted Nobel laureates and Fields Medal winners more often than family meals. By age 12, she attended university lectures. By 16, she'd published her first paper in a peer-reviewed journal. Her doctorate at 23 from Harvard wasn't just an achievement, it was destiny fulfilled. Northwestern offered her a position at 28, making her the youngest tenured professor in the university's history. Now at 30, she ruled her domain with an iron fist wrapped in designer clothing and academic credentials. Her office displayed framed degrees, prestigious awards, photographs with famous mathematicians, but not a single personal item unrelated to her career. She arrived each morning at 6:30, before custodial staff finished their work, because watching them clean made her uncomfortable in ways she refused to examine. These people who worked with their hands, who cleaned up after others, represented everything she'd been taught to rise above. She'd developed a particular habit of never making eye contact with service workers, as if acknowledging them might somehow diminish her own status. The pressure from the university board had been mounting for 2 years. Her last significant publication was aging, and younger professors were making waves with innovative research. Whispers in faculty meetings suggested her position might have been premature. She needed something spectacular to cement her position at the top of the academic hierarchy. Ethan Ward's story traveled a different trajectory entirely. His mother, Linda Ward, was a high school English teacher who noticed her 4-year-old son arranging toy blocks in complex geometric patterns. By 6, he solved algebra problems. By 10, he attended community college calculus classes. Yale's program for the exceptionally gifted accepted him at 16, and his mother cried for hours, whispering that all her sacrifices had been worth it. At Yale, Ethan flourished like a plant finally given sunlight. His work on nonlinear differential equations caught international attention. At 19, he became the youngest recipient of the prestigious Fields Medal. Tech companies offered him millions. Universities worldwide competed for his attention. The future spread before him like an infinite equation with only positive solutions. Then came the phone call that shattered everything. His mother had collapsed during class. The diagnosis was devastating. A rare cancer attacking her nervous system. Treatment existed at a specialized facility in Switzerland. Experimental but promising. The cost was astronomical. $200,000, just to begin. With no insurance coverage for experimental procedures. Ethan didn't hesitate. He withdrew from Yale overnight. Liquidated everything. Took out loans under his own name. He worked 3 jobs, slept 3 hours nightly, and watched his mother fade, despite everything. She died 6 months later in a state hospital, holding his hand and apologizing through morphine-dulled pain for ruining his life. The grief drowned his ambition entirely. He burned his research papers behind the hospital, deleted every academic contact, threw his medals in a dumpster. The mathematical prodigy Ethan Ward ceased to exist. In his place stood a hollow man who took whatever work he could find. 5 years later, he pushed a mop at Northwestern University, the very institution that had once begged him to join their faculty. Every night after students left, he'd stand before the equations on the blackboards, solving them mentally before erasing them with his cleaning cloth. It was his secret ritual, a way to touch the life he'd abandoned without fully returning to it. The mathematics department never knew that their janitor had once been offered their most prestigious research position. 3 days after the initial encounter, the confrontation began during Professor Rhodes' advanced calculus class. She was explaining a particularly complex proof when Ethan entered to empty waste baskets. She paused mid-sentence, her jaw tightening with visible annoyance at the interruption. "Could you come back later? We're in the middle of something important here." Her tone suggested that nothing he could be doing could possibly matter compared to her lecture. Ethan nodded apologetically and turned to leave. But his eyes caught the board where she'd made a subtle but critical error in her derivation. The mistake would invalidate everything that followed. Without thinking, years of suppressed instinct taking over, he murmured, "The third line should be negative." The room fell completely silent. 22 students turned to stare at the janitor, who just corrected their brilliant professor. The silence stretched like a taut wire about to snap. Amelia's face flushed red, starting from her neck and spreading to her carefully made-up cheeks. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" Her voice carried a dangerous edge that made several students sink lower in their seats. Ethan realized his mistake immediately, feeling the weight of every eye upon him. "Nothing, Professor. I apologize. I'll come back later." He gripped his cart handle, preparing to escape. But a student in the front row, Marcus Chen, was already checking the work on his laptop. "Professor Rhodes," Marcus said hesitantly. "He's actually right. The sign is wrong in line 3. The humiliation burned through Amelia, like acid corroding metal. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned back to the board, verified the error, and corrected it without acknowledgement. The classroom atmosphere grew thick with second-hand embarrassment. She turned to Ethan with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. A predator's smile. "Since you seem to know so much about mathematics, perhaps you'd like to solve the equation from Monday night. After all, my offer still stands. Solve it, and I'll marry you." The mockery in her voice was sharp enough to cut glass. Several students laughed uncomfortably, the sound hollow in the tense room. Others looked away, embarrassed by their professor's cruelty. Ethan's hands tightened on his cart handle until his knuckles went white. For the first time in 5 years, he felt the old fire stirring in his chest. Not for the promise of marriage to this cold, arrogant woman, but for the chance to be himself again, even if just for a moment. The mathematician he'd buried with his mother was clawing its way to the surface. "Fine," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the earthquake inside him. "Give me 1 week." The challenge hung in the air between them, and Professor Rhodes laughed, the sound echoing off the walls. "1 week it is. Don't disappoint me." As Ethan left with his cart, he heard her tell the class, "This is what happens when people don't know their place." That night, Ethan climbed the stairs to the university library for the first time since starting his janitorial job 3 years ago. His keycard granted after-hours access for cleaning, but he'd never used it for this purpose. The mathematics section stood before him like a cathedral of forgotten dreams, each spine a memory of who he used to be. He pulled down volume after volume, with hands that trembled slightly, his fingers remembering the texture of academic pages, the smell of knowledge preserved in print. The equation Professor Rhodes had written wasn't just complex, it was a masterpiece of mathematical cruelty, combining elements from topology, number theory, and quantum mechanics in ways that shouldn't work together. It was designed to be unsolvable, a trap to humiliate anyone foolish enough to attempt it. He spread his work across a table in the furthest corner, away from security cameras and late-night graduate students. The familiar rhythm returned slowly, like a musician picking up an instrument after years of silence. Each symbol he wrote felt like coming home and saying goodbye simultaneously. His mother's face kept appearing in his mind, not sick and frail as she'd been at the end, but vibrant and proud as she'd been when he won his first mathematics competition at 12. "You have a gift, Ethan," she'd said, her hand warm on his shoulder. "Don't let anyone make you feel ashamed of it." But shame was all he'd felt for 5 years. Shame that his gift hadn't been enough to save her. By 3 in the morning, he'd filled 20 pages with calculations, pursuing approaches and abandoning them, circling the problem like a wolf stalking prey. The janitor's uniform felt strange now, like a costume he'd worn so long he'd forgotten it wasn't his real skin. As dawn approached, he carefully gathered his papers, hiding them in a supply closet only he could access, then returned to his regular rounds. As he cleaned the mathematics building, he noticed something he'd never paid attention to before. The late-night lights in various offices, graduate students and professors wrestling with their own problems. He wasn't alone in this dance with numbers. He'd just been dancing in the shadows. Professor Jennifer Martinez passed him in the hallway, and for the first time, she nodded and said, "Good morning." The acknowledgement felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. Word of the janitor's challenge spread through the mathematics department like wildfire consuming dry timber. Students created a Facebook group called Janitor versus Professor that gained 300 members in 2 days. They began taking photos whenever they spotted Ethan, turning him into an unwilling campus celebrity. The rumors grew more elaborate with each telling. Some claimed he was a Russian spy, gathering intelligence. Others insisted he was an eccentric billionaire researching a movie role. A few suggested he was Professor Rhodes's ex-lover seeking revenge. The student newspaper ran a front-page story with the headline, "David versus Goliath." Can a janitor solve the impossible? Amelia heard every whisper, each one stoking her anger to new heights. The idea that this nobody, this maintenance worker, had dared to challenge her publicly was intolerable. She began arriving earlier and staying later, determined to solve the equation herself before the week ended. Her regular research fell by the wayside as she obsessed over the problem. On Thursday morning, she discovered something that made her blood run cold. Someone had been using the spare blackboard in the abandoned seminar room, the one nobody had used since Professor Harrison retired 2 years ago. The work was elegant, approaching the problem from an angle she'd never considered. The handwriting was neat but unpracticed, as if someone was remembering how to write mathematics rather than doing it regularly. She photographed everything with her phone before erasing it, spending the entire day trying to understand the methodology. The approach used techniques from papers published in the last year, things no amateur would know. That evening, she waited in the shadows outside the seminar room like a detective on a stakeout. At midnight, Ethan appeared with his cleaning cart. But instead of cleaning, he went straight to the blackboard and continued where the previous work had been erased. She watched through the door's narrow window in growing disbelief as he worked through transformations she'd only seen in the most advanced journals. His movements were confident now, the hesitation gone as he lost himself in the mathematics. When he suddenly sensed her presence and turned around, she was already gone, her worldview cracking like ice under spring Sunday. She practically ran to her office, where she sat in the dark, trying to reconcile what she'd witnessed with everything she believed about the world's natural order. Friday afternoon, the video appeared on the university's social media page. A student named Jennifer Wu had been practicing a presentation in an empty classroom when Ethan entered to clean. The board still contained a problem from an earlier class, a graduate-level differential equation that had stumped several PhD candidates. Jennifer, recognizing him from the rumors, asked jokingly if he could solve it, her phone already recording for what she assumed would be a funny failure to share with friends. What happened next was captured in crystal-clear footage that would be viewed over 1,000,000 times. Ethan studied the board for 30 seconds, his eyes moving in patterns that suggested deep analysis rather than confusion. Then he picked up chalk and began solving the equation with the kind of fluid confidence that comes from true understanding. He worked through the problem in under 3 minutes, explaining each step in a clear, patient voice that revealed not just knowledge, but the ability to teach. "You see here," he said to Jennifer, who stood frozen in shock. "The trick is recognizing this as a hidden Laplace transformation. Once you see that, the rest follows naturally." The video went viral within hours, shared across academic forums and social media platforms. It reached the dean's office before dinner. Dean Robert Thompson, a man who'd led the university for 15 years, watched it 3 times before calling an emergency faculty meeting for Saturday morning. The conference room filled with professors from multiple departments, all having seen the video. They played it repeatedly on the projection screen, pausing to examine Ethan's work. "This is graduate-level material," Professor Harrison muttered, adjusting his glasses for a better look. "No, David, this is beyond graduate level. The approach he used wasn't published until last year in the Journal of Advanced Mathematics." Professor Martinez added, "I've seen that handwriting before, on boards left unerased in the morning. I thought it was a graduate student working nights." The dean turned to Amelia, who sat rigid in her chair. "Professor Rhodes, you issued this challenge publicly. The university's reputation is now involved. We need to know, can this man actually solve your equation?" The humiliation was complete. She had to admit she didn't know, that the work she'd seen him do suggested he might actually succeed. "Then we need to verify this properly," the dean decided, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Monday morning. Public demonstration in the main lecture hall. If he can do what he claims, we need to know who this man really is." As faculty members filed out, discussing the unprecedented situation, Amelia remained seated, staring at the frozen video frame of Ethan at the blackboard. Professor Harrison lingered, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Amelia, I've been teaching for 40 years. I've seen prodigies and frauds. And that man is no fraud. Whatever his story is, you might want to prepare yourself for Monday." Monday morning arrived gray and drizzling, the November sky matching the somber mood that had settled over campus. The largest lecture hall, with a capacity of 500, was packed beyond limits. Faculty from mathematics, physics, engineering, and even humanities departments filled the front rows. Graduate students stood along the walls. Undergraduate mathematics majors sat in clusters, phones ready to record history. Local news crews from 3 stations set up cameras in the back, their reporters practicing their introductions. The university's PR team looked nervous, unsure whether they were about to witness triumph or disaster. The board had been cleaned and prepared with the equation exactly as Amelia had written it a week ago, covering 3 full panels with its intimidating complexity. She stood at the podium in her best suit. A navy ensemble that usually made her feel powerful, but now felt like armor that couldn't protect her. The clock on the wall showed 9:58. At exactly 10 o'clock, Ethan walked in wearing his janitor's uniform. The room erupted in whispers and phone cameras, emerged from pockets like flowers turning toward Sunday. He looked smaller somehow under the harsh stage lights, more vulnerable than the mysterious figure who'd been haunting the mathematics building at night. His hands shook slightly as he approached the board. And Amelia noticed he'd attempted to clean the permanent stains from under his fingernails. She forced herself to speak, her voice steady despite the chaos inside her. "Mr. Ward, you claimed you could solve this equation. The terms remain the same. If you successfully solve it, I'll honor my original statement." The words tasted like ash in her mouth, each syllable a small death of the world she'd known. Ethan picked up the chalk, its weight familiar and foreign simultaneously. For a moment, he stood frozen, feeling the eyes of hundreds on his back, the weight of expectation and skepticism in equal measure. Then his mother's voice echoed in his memory. "Don't let anyone make you feel ashamed of your gift," and he began to write. The room fell absolutely silent except for the sound of chalk on board. His approach was unconventional, starting with a transformation that made several professors lean forward in surprise. He worked methodically, but with increasing confidence, filling board after board with increasingly elegant mathematics. 40 minutes passed. Then, an hour. Nobody moved. Several professors had pulled out notebooks, following along with his work, occasionally nodding or gasping at particularly brilliant moves. When he finally set down the chalk and stepped back, the complete solution covered 5 blackboards. The silence stretched for 10 heartbeats before Professor Harrison, the department's most senior mathematician with 40 years of experience, stood up slowly. "My God," he said, his voice carrying across the silent hall. "It's not just correct, it's beautiful. This is publishable work." The eruption that followed was deafening. The applause was thunderous. Students standing on chairs to see better. Professors pushing forward to examine the work more closely. Cameras flashing like strobe lights at a concert. But Ethan only had eyes for Amelia, who stood frozen at the podium, her face pale as paper, her carefully constructed world collapsing around her. The equation she'd thought unsolvable, the challenge she'd issued as a cruel joke, had been conquered by a man she'd dismissed as beneath notice. When the chaos finally subsided enough for her to speak, her voice barely carried to the microphone. "The solution is correct," she confirmed, each word feeling like a stone in her throat. The crowd exploded again. But Ethan raised his hand for quiet. When he spoke, his voice was steady and clear, carrying the kind of authority that comes from truth. "Professor Rhodes, I don't expect you to honor a promise made in mockery. I didn't solve this for that." He paused, meeting her eyes directly, and she saw in them not triumph but sadness. "I solved it because for 5 years, I've been invisible in these halls. I've mopped these floors, emptied these trash cans, and been looked through like I was made of glass. Not just by you, but by almost everyone. I solved it because I wanted, just once, to be seen for who I really am. Not a janitor, not a servant, a mathematician." The room was silent now, the weight of his words settling over everyone like snow. "All I've ever wanted from anyone here, from you especially, Professor, was basic respect. The same respect you'd give any human being, regardless of their job title or bank account." Someone in the back started clapping slowly, then others joined. But Ethan wasn't finished. "My name is Ethan Ward. 5 years ago, I was the youngest recipient of the Fields Medal for my work on nonlinear differential equations. I left mathematics to care for my dying mother. And after she passed, I couldn't find my way back. I've been hiding here, in plain sight, because being invisible hurt less than remembering who I used to be." The revelation sent shockwaves through the room. Professors pulled out phones, searching his name, finding archived articles about the prodigy who'd disappeared. "But solving this equation reminded me that hiding from pain doesn't heal it. It just spreads it around. Makes you treat others the way you feel inside worthless." He looked directly at Amelia, Professor Rhodes, you're brilliant. Your work on topology is groundbreaking. But brilliance without humanity is just cold light. It illuminates nothing that matters. He turned and walked toward the door, leaving behind 5 boards of perfect mathematics and a room full of people reconsidering everything they thought they knew. As he reached the exit, he paused. The equation has a second solution, by the way, even more elegant than the first. Perhaps Professor Rhodes would like to find it. Then he was gone, leaving Amelia standing at the podium with tears she couldn't hold back anymore. Streaming down her face in front of 500 witnesses to her humiliation and his grace. That evening, Amelia did something she'd never done before in her 3 years at Northwestern. She went to the basement where the custodial staff had their break room and supply closets. She found Ethan in his usual closet. A small windowless room that smelled of industrial cleaner and resignation, organizing supplies as if nothing had happened. "We need to talk," she said, standing in the doorway. He didn't turn around, his hands continuing to arrange bottles of floor wax. "There's nothing to talk about. You don't owe me anything, Professor Rhodes." She stepped into the small space, closing the door behind her, her designer heels incongruous on the stained concrete floor. "I owe you an apology, and an explanation, if you'll let me give it." For the next hour, she talked about her childhood in that Cambridge mansion, the pressure of being the only child of 2 genius parents, the fear of being seen as anything less than perfect. She told him about dinner parties where Nobel laureates discussed her potential as if she weren't there, about teachers who held her to impossible standards, about relationships that failed because she couldn't stop competing long enough to connect. He listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding, as if her words confirmed something he'd already guessed. When she finished, he finally turned to face her. "I looked you up," he said quietly. "After that first night, I know about your papers, your research, your achievements. You're brilliant, Professor Rhodes. But brilliance without humanity is just cold light." She felt the tears come then, hot and unstoppable, years of suppressed emotion breaking through. "Who are you really?" she asked through the tears. So he told her everything. Yale at 16, the Fields Medal at 19, his mother's diagnosis, the impossible choice between his future and her life. He told her about the 3 jobs, the sleepless nights, watching her fade despite everything. She was a high school English teacher, he said, his voice thick with memory. "She never earned more than 40,000 a year. But she gave everything for me. When she got sick, I thought my success would save her. I thought mathematics could solve any problem if you were smart enough." His voice broke. "I was wrong. All the awards, all the recognition, none of it mattered when she needed that treatment. The hospital administrator didn't care about my Fields Medal when I couldn't pay. She died apologizing to me, saying she'd ruined my life. Can you imagine? She was dying, and she was worried about my career." Amelia found herself sitting on an overturned bucket, her $1,000 suit forgotten, seeing him clearly for the first time. "You gave up everything for her," she whispered. "And I wouldn't change it," he replied. "Love isn't about what you achieve. It's about what you sacrifice. My mother taught me that. I just wish I'd learned it sooner." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning neither was ready to acknowledge. She stood to leave, then paused at the door. "The university is going to offer you a position. The dean called an hour ago. They want you to head a new research initiative." He shook his head. "I'm not ready for that life again. The pressure, the competition, the constant need to prove yourself, I can't." She studied him for a long moment, seeing not the janitor or the genius but the man caught between 2 worlds. What if you didn't have to do it alone? The question surprised them both. She left before he could answer. But the seed was planted, and they both knew something fundamental had shifted between them. Walking through the rain to her car, Amelia thought about the woman she'd been that morning and realized that person felt like a stranger. Ethan had solved more than just her equation. He'd solved something in her she hadn't known was broken. Over the next 3 weeks, Amelia found herself returning to that supply closet again and again, drawn by something she couldn't name. At first, she brought mathematical journals, sharing new developments in fields Ethan had been away from. They discussed the Poincaré conjecture's solution, advances in quantum computing applications, and the emergence of new mathematical frameworks for understanding artificial intelligence. Their discussions were careful, professional, but gradually the walls began to crumble. She learned about his life beyond mathematics, his love of jazz, particularly John Coltrane's mathematical approach to improvisation. She discovered he could fix anything mechanical, a skill learned from necessity when he couldn't afford repairs. He showed her how he saw patterns in everything from the way people walked to the rhythm of rain on windows. In return, he learned about her insecurities, the imposter syndrome that plagued her despite her achievements, the loneliness of being the youngest and most successful in every room. "Sometimes I feel like I'm performing myself," she confided one evening. "Like the real me disappeared somewhere in graduate school. And all that's left is this character I play, the brilliant, cold professor who needs no one." They began working together on a new proof, meeting in the abandoned seminar room after hours. The collaboration felt natural, inevitable, as if they'd been working together for years. Amelia discovered that Ethan's approach to mathematics was entirely different from hers: intuitive, where she was methodical; elegant, where she was forceful. He saw mathematical relationships the way musicians hear harmonies, instantaneous and whole. She provided the rigorous framework to capture his insights, to translate his intuition into formal proof. Their combined work produced something neither could have achieved alone. The university's offer remained on the table, sweetened each week as word of Ethan's genius spread through academic circles. Old colleagues from Yale reached out through the university email system. Tech companies sent recruiters. The Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton expressed interest, but he declined them all. "I'm not ready," he told Amelia one night as they worked side by side, their shoulders almost touching. "Maybe I'll never be ready." She set down her chalk and turned to him fully. "What if the issue isn't readiness? What if it's fear?" He looked at her sharply. "Fear of what?" She chose her words carefully, speaking to herself as much as to him. "Fear that if you step back into that light, you'll lose yourself again. Fear that success will mean sacrificing something else you love. Fear that the world will demand you be the prodigy instead of the person." The accuracy of her observation stunned them both. "But what if," she continued, her voice soft, "you could have both? Success and humanity? Achievement and connection?" Their eyes met and held, the air between them charged with possibility. "Is that what you're doing?" he asked. "Trying to have both?" She nodded slowly. "I'm trying to learn. You're teaching me, whether you know it or not. Every time you treat the other custodial staff with respect, every time you solve a problem not for glory but for the joy of it, every time you choose kindness over being right, you're teaching me there's another way to be brilliant." The breakthrough came on a Tuesday night in early December. They'd been working on their joint proof for 6 weeks, and suddenly all the pieces clicked into place like tumblers in a lock. Ethan wrote the final transformation with a flourish, and they both stood back, staring at what they'd created. It was beautiful in the way only mathematics can be beautiful, elegant, inevitable, true. The proof would revolutionize an entire subfield of topology, opening new avenues for research that would keep mathematicians busy for decades. "We did it," Amelia breathed, her voice filled with wonder. "You did it." Ethan corrected automatically. "This was your idea. Your framework." She shook her head emphatically. "No, we did this together. Neither of us could have done it alone. Don't you see? This is what mathematics should be: collaboration, not competition. Building something together, not tearing others down to rise higher." The truth of that statement resonated deeply for both of them. Without planning, without thought, she reached out and took his hand. He didn't pull away. His fingers intertwined with hers, and they stood there, two brilliant minds connected by more than just mathematics. "Ethan, the university wants to offer you a full research position. Not teaching if you don't want it, just pure research. You could keep your other job if it makes you comfortable, but you'd have resources, respect, everything you deserve." She squeezed his hand. "You wouldn't be alone. I would be there, as your collaborator, your colleague, your—" She stopped, unable to say the word that hung between them. He was quiet for a long moment, looking at their joined hands. "On one condition," he finally said. "We publish this paper together. Equal authors. No senior, no junior. Equals." She felt tears prick her eyes. "I wouldn't have it any other way." He smiled then, the expression transforming his usually serious face into something young and alive. "There's something else," he said. "That equation you gave me, it has a second solution. I found it the third night. It's even more beautiful than the first." She stared at him. "You mean you could have—" "I wanted to solve it the hard way first, to prove to myself I still could. But also—" He hesitated, then continued. "I wanted more time, more excuses to talk to you, to work near you, to watch you think. You're beautiful when you're thinking, Did you know that? You get this little furrow between your eyebrows, and you bite your lower lip, and your whole face lights up when you see the solution. She was crying now, not caring that it ruined her makeup. Ethan Ward. Are you saying you deliberately prolonged this whole thing because I was falling in love with you? Yes. From that first night, when you challenged me with such confident cruelty, I saw through it to the fear underneath. You were terrified someone would see that you're human, that you have doubts, that you're not perfect. I recognized it because I've been hiding the same way, just from the opposite direction. He raised their joined hands and kissed her fingers gently. We're quite a pair, aren't we? The professor who's afraid to be human, and the human who's afraid to be a professor. The International Mathematics Conference in Chicago the following month was the event of the year in their field. The grand ballroom of the Palmer House Hilton was packed with 800 of the world's greatest mathematical minds. Amelia and Ethan stood together at the podium, presenting their joint proof to an audience that included 3 Fields Medal winners and representatives from every major university. Ethan wore a simple black suit that Amelia had helped him choose, having refused anything more elaborate. I'm not trying to impress anyone, he'd said. Amelia had chosen an outfit that was professional but understated, a far cry from her usual power dressing. They took turns explaining different sections of the proof, their presentation style naturally complementary. Where Ethan provided intuitive leaps, Amelia offered rigorous justification. Where she built formal structures, he showed the elegant shortcuts. They were like 2 dancers who'd found their perfect partner, each movement synchronized and graceful. When they finished, the applause was thunderous and sustained. During the question period, Professor Kumar from Stanford asked about their unusual collaboration. Professor Rhodes, Mr. Ward, your backgrounds couldn't be more different. How did you find common ground? Amelia took the microphone first. I learned that brilliance comes in many forms and from unexpected places. My prejudices nearly cost me the opportunity to work with one of the finest mathematical minds of our generation. More than that, they nearly cost me the chance to know an extraordinary human being, Ethan added. And I learned that hiding from the world doesn't protect you from pain. It just guarantees you'll face it alone. Professor Rhodes didn't just collaborate with me on this proof. She helped me find my way back to myself. After the presentation, they stood in the conference center lobby, watching the Chicago skyline darken as evening approached. Snow had begun to fall, dusting the city in white. That wasn't so bad, Ethan said with a slight smile. You were wonderful, Amelia replied, then caught herself. Your presentation was wonderful. He turned to her fully, taking both her hands in his. Amelia, that night a year ago, when you said you'd marry anyone who could solve that equation, it was a joke. A cruel joke born from your own insecurity, I know that. But somewhere along the way, working with you, learning who you really are beneath the armor you wear, I started to wonder what it would be like if it wasn't a joke. Her breath caught in her throat. Ethan, I was horrible to you. I represented everything wrong with academic elitism, with judging people by their titles instead of their character. He shook his head. You were a person shaped by your environment, just like I was. But you changed. You saw me. Really saw me. When I'd forgotten how to see myself. And then you helped me remember who I could be. Not who I was, but who I could become. She stepped closer, close enough to feel his warmth. So what are you saying? He smiled, the expression transforming his entire face. I'm saying that equation was the hardest thing I've solved in 5 years. But understanding how I feel about you, that might take a lifetime of work. The good news is, mathematicians are very patient people. She laughed, the sound bright and genuine. Nothing like the sharp laugh she'd wielded as a weapon for so many years. Good thing we have tenure then. He pulled her closer, and there in the lobby of the Palmer House Hilton, surrounded by the greatest mathematical minds of their generation, Ethan Ward kissed Amelia Rhodes. It wasn't the marriage she'd mockingly promised, but it was a beginning. The equation that had brought them together was now published and acclaimed. But the proof of their connection needed no peer review. It was written in the way they looked at each other, in the space they made for each other's dreams, and in the understanding that true partnership meant seeing beyond surface differences to the person underneath. 6 months later, the university held a special ceremony to officially welcome Dr. Ethan Ward to the faculty. He'd accepted the research position with his unusual stipulation intact. He would continue janitorial duties for 1 hour each day. It keeps me grounded, he'd explained to the bewildered dean. It reminds me that every person in this building, regardless of their job, deserves respect. The dean, recognizing the profound truth in this, had not only agreed but instituted new policies, ensuring all support staff were treated with greater dignity, including better wages, educational opportunities, and a voice in university decisions. The ceremony was held in the same lecture hall, where Ethan had solved the impossible equation. This time, he stood at the podium in his professor's robes, with Amelia beside him. The audience included not just faculty and students but also the entire custodial staff, sitting in the front row at Ethan's insistence. His acceptance speech was brief but powerful. A year ago, I stood in this room and solved an equation. But the real problem that needed solving wasn't mathematical. It was human. It was about how we see each other, how we value each other, how we miss the extraordinary and the ordinary because we're too busy looking up or down instead of straight ahead. He looked at Amelia, who was trying not to cry. Professor Rhodes challenged me with an impossible equation, but she gave me something more valuable than any mathematical proof. She gave me the courage to be myself again. And then she gave me something even more precious. The knowledge that being myself was enough. The audience erupted in applause, but Ethan raised his hand for silence. There's one more thing. Professor Rhodes, a year ago you made a promise. A joke. Yes, but a promise nonetheless. He dropped to one knee, pulling out a simple silver ring with a small diamond that caught the light like a star. I've solved your equation, both solutions actually. So, Amelia Rhodes, will you marry me? Not because of a challenge or a joke, but because you've become the constant in every equation of my life? The hall fell silent. Amelia stood frozen for a moment, then laughed, not her old sharp laugh but something warm and full of joy. Yes, she said, pulling him to his feet. Yes, but I have a condition too. You have to teach me that second solution. We're equals, remember? As they kissed, the hall erupted in cheers that could be heard across campus. Professor Harrison, watching from the faculty section, leaned over to his colleague and said, "You know, in 40 years of teaching, I've never seen mathematics bring people together quite like this." His colleague nodded. Perhaps that's because they weren't really solving for X. They were solving for why we do this, why it matters, why brilliance without humanity is just cold light. Outside, spring had come to Northwestern, and the courtyard trees were beginning to bloom. Two people who'd found each other through the language of mathematics walked hand in hand toward a future that, like the best equations, was elegant in its simplicity and infinite in its possibilities. The janitor who'd become a professor, and the professor who'd learned to be human, had solved the most important problem of all, how to see each other clearly, completely, and with love.